Hi everyone, we're going to go to Revelations chapters 14 and 15, and we see a difference right off the bat. John said that he looked and beheld in verse 1 that he saw the Lamb on Mount Zion, and Mount Zion is Jerusalem, and so Jesus is somehow presented here as a lamb. I don't think it's a four-footed beast that we see in the barnyard. I think it's Jesus and his great humility showing the marks of his suffering for everyone to see. And he's standing in the earth at Mount Zion with 144,000 who have the Father's name written on their foreheads. And this kind of, we'll call it a tattoo, is evident to everybody. And it's one of the great promises in Scripture that Jesus had proclaimed to the seven churches of those who overcome would have God's name written on them. And it's in direct contrast to what we had been reading in Revelation 13, the mark of the beast, which was also some kind of, we'll call it a tattoo. I don't know if it's digital or if it's physical or how that will show up. But it's one of the big fascinating parts of the book of Revelation. Unbelievers know about this mark. They know about 666. Movies are made about it. Books have written about it in popular culture. And so it's a huge thing. But what's interesting between these two marks, those who followed the beast had a mark written on their forehead as well. But if they didn't get that mark, they couldn't buy or sell. So it's not coming out of devotion. It's not coming as a reward for overcoming or allegiance. It's forced upon them. They cannot buy or sell. They can't be in business. Probably they can't travel. They can't fly. They can't do anything. In some cases, probably not be able to keep their job unless they have this mark. And so it comes out of a forced loyalty, forced upon them, and I see little telltale signs of that emerging in our society today. The Vatican recently put out a statement that said you cannot work at the Vatican unless you got the jab, which is the vaccination. No jab, no job. And it really got a lot of back push, people just resisting that kind of thing. But our own government is doing the same kind of thing, where the pressure to get vaccinated, which is not the mark of the beast, and I'm not tying those two things together. What I am tying together is this: anytime there's from the top down forced obedience, forced compliance, whatever it is, whether it's there's lots of different aspects of that in society, but I think the latest one that is very troubling is this whole thing of getting a vaccination. I just read a headline recently that said that in Israel they're trying to get everybody vaccinated, and the most conservative Hasidic Jews are refusing to get the vaccination, probably for the same reason that I'm citing here, is that it's forced upon them. And because they're refusing to get it, there's a lot of social indignation against them. There's social shaming that's going on. They just passed a law saying that they can publish the names of those who refuse to get the vaccination in the newspaper. So again, it's forced compliance. And anytime we see this emerging in society, it's happened at different times in church history that you have to wear a certain thing or be made distinct from your fellow countrymen in some way, put on you by the government, put on you by the powers that be. It's wrong. And it's not the mark, but it's the same kind of thinking. It's the same kind of apparatus that's used to control people. And even in Christian circles, even in the church where there's forced conformity, that you all have to look the same, you have to dress the same. There's something wrong with that in terms of there's a spirit behind that. Plus there's a man-made authority requires conformity. It's the way that you're telling me that you're buying what I'm saying is you must conform. Where with God and His kingdom, the fact that there's variety and different colors, and we see that in nature with flowers and trees and birds, that He loves variety. You don't have to be the same color to be called a bird. You're free to have your own color, and however God has created you. And it's not something where uniformity is forced on us. This is going to be a big issue. It's a big issue today. But there's a contrast between those who are following the beast and those who are following the Lamb. And those who are following the Lamb, they sang a new song before the throne. And it leads to worship. And worship is an indicator of freedom. It's a tremendous indicator of freedom. And they sang before the Lord. And no one knew the song except the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth. And these are the ones who had not defiled themselves with women. They are virgins. They follow the Lamb wherever He goes. They were redeemed from among men as the firstfruits to God and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no deceit, and no fault was found in them before the throne of God. What an amazing thing. What a contrast between those who follow the Lamb and those who follow the beast. As we see in verse 6, there's these proclamations by these three angels. I don't quite understand this. I'd have to look at it a little deeper, but these angels, one of them was flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people. I'm not sure that it's the gospel that we preach, salvation. I don't think anyone can preach that unless you've experienced salvation. I don't think angels who've never experienced salvation can actually preach it. But they're proclaiming news, and they are messengers. And so they can proclaim good news. And they're saying with a loud voice, verse 7, "Fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of judgment has come." So they're proclaiming something that everyone's been longing for and listening for. And so this is a great moment of vindication, great moment where God's going to take control. And we're wanting to see that. I don't think they're proclaiming salvation so that people would become saved, but they're definitely proclaiming good news. They're messengers of God. One of the things that they proclaimed in verse 8 is Babylon has fallen. Babylon has fallen, the great city, and she has made the nations to drink the wine of her wrath, of her fornication. And another angel, he's proclaiming that if anyone worships the beast or receives the mark on his forehead or on his hand, he himself shall also drink the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out in full strength into the cup of his indignation. And so these are three angels that are proclaiming three powerful messages that people have been looking for, longing for. And verse 12 is a great key. And it says, "Herein is the patience of the saints." Here is the patience of the saints here, are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. It said, "Blessed are those who are dead, who die in the Lord from now on." And there's a patience, there's an endurance. If you can imagine not being able to buy or sell unless you had this mark, and you withstood that, plus all the public scorn, the public shame, that you're on the losing side, you're on the losing side of it, and you can't work, you can't travel. Just recently they're talking about getting a digital passport that has your number in to show that you cannot, that you have been vaccinated, now you're free to travel. A gal from another country was just with us, and as she made her way back during these COVID days back to her country, she had to show evidence of a negative test that she took, that she didn't have COVID. And they just stopped her every way along the way. They stopped her at every point to see that she had this proof of a negative test. And that's a little thing. And I would say I understand that. They don't want the disease to come into their country. I understand that. They're trying to control it. But there's a point where it exceeds that. And I think we're going to see that in these coming months, not years. In coming months, we're going to be tested. Our own patience, our own endurance, whether we'll keep faith, whether it will divide the church, that tension that's in society, the mocking that's going to come for those who refuse to get vaccinated. Just so you know, I don't care about the vaccination. I'm not opposed to that. If someone got it, it means nothing to me. I've gotten flu jabs before a few times. It means nothing to me. It's the sense of being told that you have to have it. And if you don't have it, you cannot do this or you cannot do that. You can't go to school. You can't work. You can't work for the Vatican. Of course, since then, they've gotten so much flack from that. They've backpedaled from that. I don't think that's their position right at this moment, but it was for about a week. I think we're going to be tested. I think it's going to be the patience of the saints in our generation to see and to see whether we'll comply, whether we'll just be mindlessly obeying. And I think it's going to create enormous tension in the church. And that's actually what I'm most concerned about, that it could cause divisions among Christians who are either pro-vaccination or anti-vaccination. It's kind of a test, and we're going to see it. And we have to decide in ourselves that it's a conscience issue, and we're not going to override someone's conscience and force our conscience onto them or our standard onto their conscience. It's a conscience issue. And for that reason, we need to be gracious to each other. We need to be patient with each other and not use it as a way to separate from each other. There's a time in church history, very early in church history, after the apostles had died, where one of the Caesars had risen up and said that he was God. And all his followers had to worship him. And to prove their loyalty and their worship to him, they had to go to a temple. And there were lots of temples in those days. Everywhere there were temples. And they had to go to a temple and offer a pinch of incense to him as God, to worship him as Lord. And if you did this, you got a certificate. The certificate proved that you had done this. Well, there are many Christians who said, well, we don't want to do this, but we will do it because we want our freedom. We want to go on with our lives. It means nothing to us. It's not something we're doing from the heart. We don't really believe he's God. We believe that Jesus is Lord. But let's just comply. Let's just do it. We'll go through the motions, but our hearts won't be in it. And so they went ahead and they did it. There are other people who said, we refuse to do this. And as a result of refusing to offer this incense to Caesar, they were killed, or their children were killed, or their young people in the church were killed. And so, there was blood shed over this. It was a real tension, real testing time for the church. Then there were other Christians who said, this doesn't mean anything to us either, but we're just going to buy a certificate. We're going to pay under the table and get that certificate that says that we've done it, but we'll just pay for it. We'll just buy it. Many of them did that. And then the Caesar decided that he wasn't going to hold people to it anymore, and so he said, you don't have to offer this incense to me, and he relaxed that commandment. Well, then the church all meet together again. They all come back together in the house of worship, and they look at each other, and you got guys who offer the pinch of incense. You got people who lost relatives who were martyred because they did refuse to offer. Then you got people who bought it under the table. And now these three people have to have fellowship together, and they couldn't. They so disesteemed each other, so despised each other that they couldn't have fellowship. They represented the church. It was one of the great tactics of the devil to divide and conquer, and he used this one edict to do it. And I think that could happen with vaccination when they're trying to get herd immunity generated by enough people being vaccinated. Well, I know lots of people who will not be vaccinated, not because they're concerned about the vaccine or although they're troubled by how quickly it came about, it's that it's forced on us. How are we going to navigate this whole thing? It's happened before. It will happen again. It will happen in another form. It'll take on another shape. And I'm just concerned about our complying to force top-down requirements that are put on us either by the church or by the state. But what we see here in chapter 14 is the wrath of God. It's been prophesied. There's the wrath of God that's coming with great harvest. And if you look at verse 14 on down to the end of the chapter, there's a tremendous harvest that takes place. Sickle going into the earth, the great winepress of the wrath of God, and so much so that blood flowed in the streets for hundreds of miles, about 184 miles of blood up to the horse's bridle. Just a fascinating thing of judgment taking place. Then if you watch, you see John, he's seeing what's happening in heaven. He said there's a great sign in heaven. Angels with the last 7 plagues of the wrath of God, which brings about the completion of the judgment of God. He said, I saw, in verse 2, chapter 15, verse 2, I saw a sea of glass mingled with fire, and those who have had victory over the beast, over his image, over his mark, and over the number of his name, standing on the sea of glass, having harps of God, singing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. And there's singing, there's worship. So even though there's been indignation and wrath being poured out, something that's been promised on unbelievers, there's a tremendous harvest of 144,000 and the people who heeded all of that, all of it coming together in a great culmination in worship. And if you look at verses 3 and 4, they're singing, they're worshiping the Lord. And John said he looked and he beheld and he saw the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven. It had been opened. And as a result of it opening, he says, out of the temple came 7 angels with 7 plagues, clothed in pure bright linen, having their chests girded with golden bands. And one of the 4 living creatures gave the 7 angels 7 bowls full of the wrath of God, who lives forever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, so that no one was able to stand in the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels was completed. So it's a tremendous time, a lot of activity, both in heaven and in the earth, of harvest. That's harvest of souls that brought in all kinds of people, 144,000 people who followed the Lamb, plus harvest of his wrath, where there's a great judgment that's released into the earth. And it's going to be a time of testing. It's going to be a time of patience. If we can't manage this test now, this little bit of test now, how are we going to ever stand during these great tests that are coming? And people can console themselves by saying, well, we won't be here. Somehow we're going to be raptured before this comes. Well, that'd be nice. That'd be wonderful if that happens. I just don't know. I just don't know if we will be seeing this, if there will be believers on the earth during this time of great upheaval, both in heaven and in the earth. A lot of activity coming, a lot of activity taking place, but it's our greatest hour. It's a time of testing. Amen.